The silk sheets itch against your skin, not because they're dirty, but because you're not supposed to be here. You're a servant, and you've been summoned after midnight again. The king's voice slurs through the walls. Something crashes. Glass? Bone? Laughter follows. Then silence, the kind that tastes like blood. When the door opens, you see him, drunk, barely clothed, powdered wig askew. He stares at you like he's forgotten your name, but remembers he owns you. And this time, he doesn't want wine. This is not the story they told you in history class. This is the side of royalty they buried. If you believe the truth should survive even when power tries to bury it, subscribe and comment where you're listening from. We're here to unearth the rotted roots beneath the crown. George Augustus Frederick was born into a world that worshipped him before he drew his first breath. The year was 1762, and England needed a prince who would embody everything the monarchy promised. Grace, refinement, the divine right to rule over millions. What they got was a child who learned that wanting something meant having it. Immediately, completely, without question. Picture the nurseries at St. James's Palace. Gold-leafed walls, servants who existed solely to anticipate his needs. Tutors who praised every scribble, every tantrum, every cruel whim as evidence of royal genius. By age 7, George had his own retinue of attendants. By 10, he was deciding which servants deserved punishment for imagined slights. By 15, he understood that his desires weren't just personal preferences, they were commands that shaped reality around him. The public saw Prince George as England's golden hope. Tall, handsome, articulate, he spoke French like a native, quoted Shakespeare from memory, and moved through ballrooms with the fluid grace of a born aristocrat. London society papers breathlessly reported his fashion choices, his wit, his cultured conversations about art and literature. When he smiled, duchesses swooned. When he laughed, courtiers memorized the sound to repeat it later. But in the private chambers of Carlton House, a different George emerged after dark. He was 18 when he discovered laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, prescribed by royal physicians for a minor stomach ailment. The first dose dissolved the constant anxiety that gnawed at him, that persistent voice whispering that despite all the worship, all the praise, he might not actually be worthy of the throne he'd inherit. The second dose made him feel like a god. The third made him need a fourth. His gambling debts began piling up before his 20th birthday. Not hundreds of pounds, but tens of thousands. Enough to bankrupt entire families. He'd sit at cards for 18 hours straight, his pupils dilated from laudanum, betting money he didn't have on hands he couldn't remember playing. When he lost, which was often, he'd fly into rages that left furniture shattered and servants bloodied. The women came next. Not the refined courtship expected of a prince, but desperate, grasping encounters that left him feeling emptier than before. Married ladies seeking royal protection, young girls pushed forward by ambitious mothers, actresses hoping for patronage. He consumed them like he consumed everything else, voraciously, carelessly, moving on the moment his interest waned. By his mid-20s, George had perfected the art of living two lives. In public, the refined prince, patron of arts, fashion icon who set trends across Europe. In private, a bloated, paranoid addict who required constant feeding not just of food and drugs, but of validation, of power, of the knowledge that he could destroy lives on a whim. The kingdom saw only the mask. They celebrated his style, his alleged sophistication, his supposed devotion to British culture. They didn't see the servant girls who fled his presence in tears. They didn't hear the screams from Carlton House after midnight. They didn't know about the physicians who visited in secret, the money changers who came and went through hidden passages, the cleaners who scrubbed stains from carpets and never spoke of what they'd removed. England fell in love with an illusion, and George, somewhere beneath the layers of powder and performance, began to hate them for being so easily fooled. This was the man who would become King George IV, a creature of appetite and rage, wrapped in ermine and lies, preparing to rule over an empire that worshipped the very mask that concealed its monster. Step inside Carlton House on a winter morning in 1795. The corridors reek of stale wine, opium smoke, and something else, something rotting beneath the perfume. Your footsteps echo on marble floors as you carry another tray toward the prince's chambers. The breakfast, roasted fowl, jellied meats, sugared fruits, and 3 different wines. It's 10 in the morning, but time means nothing here. Day and night blur into one endless cycle of appetite and unconsciousness. The prince, not yet king, but already drunk on power, hasn't left his rooms in 4 days. The physicians come and go like ghosts, carrying leather satchels filled with bottles whose contents they never name. Dr. Halford whispers consultations with Dr. Ruff. Knighton in corners, their voices tight with professional concern and personal fear. They know what they're enabling, they know what they're feeding, but the prince pays their salaries, owns their reputations, and could destroy their careers with a single word. The king is unwell, but no one says it aloud. Behind those gilt-covered doors lies George's true kingdom, a series of rooms where reality bends to accommodate his hungers. The bedroom walls are painted with scenes of Roman excess. Bacchanalian feasts, reclining emperors, servants offering wine and flesh with equal devotion. The furniture groans under the weight of silver platters, crystal decanters, and the prince himself, who has grown so large that special chairs must be commissioned to hold him. His morning routine begins at noon. Laudanum first, 2 full spoonfuls in brandy to quiet the shaking in his hands. Then breakfast, which resembles a medieval feast more than a meal. He eats with his hands sometimes, tearing at meat like an animal, pausing only to gulp wine or gesture imperiously for more. Servants stand in silence, trained never to meet his eyes, never to react when food strikes the walls or when he suddenly erupts in fury over some imagined slight. The letters arrive throughout the day. Bills from tailors, threats from moneylenders, pleas from discarded mistresses. He burns most of them without reading, watching the flames consume his debts as if fire could erase reality. The rest he uses to humiliate whoever brought them. Read this aloud. He'll command a trembling servant, forcing them to voice his shame while he laughs and reaches for another bottle. By evening, the transformation is complete. The fashionable prince of the morning newspapers has become something else entirely. A sweating, paranoid creature who sees enemies in every shadow and solace only in the bottom of a glass. He calls for his treatments, not medical procedures, but coded requests for stronger opiates, purer alcohol, more exotic combinations that his pet physicians provide without question. The servants know to stay away when the laughter turns high-pitched and manic. They know to disappear when he starts calling for specific members of staff, usually the young ones, usually the ones without family connections to protect them. They know the sounds that come from the prince's chambers after midnight aren't always pleasure. Sometimes there's something much darker. Dr. Knighton's private journal, discovered decades later, reveals the physician's growing horror at what he was witnessing. His Royal Highness consumed enough laudanum today to kill 3 ordinary men, he wrote in 1798. When I suggested reducing the dose, he flew into such a rage that I feared for my life. The prince's constitution seems built for excess, but his mind grows stranger each day. He speaks of enemies that don't exist, of plots against his person. Yesterday, he accused his valet of poisoning his wine, then forced the man to drink an entire bottle to prove his innocence. The king is unwell, but no one says it aloud. The addiction spreads like a disease through Carlton House. Not just the prince's chemical dependencies, but the institutional addiction to secrecy, to enabling, to looking away. Servants become addicted to their salaries, too generous to abandon despite what they witness. Physicians become addicted to royal patronage. Courtiers become addicted to proximity to power, even corrupted power. Food becomes another drug. The prince's meals grow more elaborate, more excessive, lasting for hours. He develops rituals around eating that border on the ceremonial, specific wines for specific courses, servants who must stand in precise formations while he feeds, elaborate presentations that he destroys in fits of rage when the mood strikes him. His body swells, but his hungers only grow sharper. The opium dreams merge with waking nightmares. He rants about conspiracy theories that become more detailed and paranoid each day. Foreign agents in his kitchens, Republican sympathizers among his guards. His own father, King George III, plotting to have him declared unfit for succession. The line between persecution, complex, and genuine guilt blurs until even the prince can't tell the difference. But every morning, the newspapers still praise his refined taste, his cultural contributions, his devotion to British arts. The public sees only the carefully crafted image, a prince who might be a little extravagant, perhaps a touch theatrical, but certainly the embodiment of royal sophistication. They don't see the servants who quit without explanation, the bills that pile up like fallen leaves, the rooms that must be aired for days to clear the stench of excess. They don't hear the sounds that echo through Carlton House when the prince's chemical courage meets his darkest impulses. The king is unwell, but no one says it aloud. And in that silence, something terrible is taking root. Something that will bloom fully when George finally claims the throne he's been destroying himself to deserve. You're a lady's maid at Carlton House, and it's 3 in the morning when you hear the screaming. Not the usual sounds, the drunken laughter, the breaking glass, the muffled sobs of departing guests. This is different, raw, desperate, human. The prince has been King George IV for 2 years now, and the crown has done nothing to contain what was already festering inside him. If anything, absolute power has given his cruelties permission to flourish. You press yourself against the corridor wall as Dr. Halford rushes past, his face pale, his medical bag clutched like a shield. Behind him trails a younger physician you don't recognize, muttering prayers under his breath. The screaming stops. The silence that follows is somehow worse. Mrs. Fitzherbert emerges from the king's chambers an hour later, her dress torn, her face a canvas of bruises that will need careful powder to hide. She was once his secret wife, a Catholic widow who thought royal love might protect her from royal rage. Now she knows better. She moves like a woman underwater, each step deliberate, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium that keeps her alive. You've seen this walk before. Lady Jersey had it, after that night in 1799 when the king's laudanum-fueled passion turned violent. Lady Hertford perfected it during her years as his mistress, learning to navigate around furniture that might become weapons, doors that might slam on fingers, hands that might grab and squeeze until something broke. The walk of women who've discovered that being desired by a king means being destroyed by one. Sarah, the kitchen maid, hasn't been seen for 3 days. The housekeeper claims she's visiting family, but you remember Sarah's terrified face when she was summoned to bring wine to the king's private study. You remember how she begged to be assigned to any other duty, any other room, anywhere but there. The new girl who replaced her, barely 16, fresh from the countryside, doesn't know to be afraid yet. She will learn. The king's journals, discovered decades later by horrified archivists, reveal the progression of his sickness. What began as casual cruelty, forcing servants to stand for hours while he ate, making them clean messes he created deliberately, evolved into something systematic, calculated. He began keeping records of which servants cried first under verbal assault. He developed games. How long could he make someone hold scalding tea before they dropped the cup? How many increasingly degrading tasks could he assign before someone quit? The girl today proved most resilient, reads one entry from 1823. I required her to crawl on hands and knees while serving my breakfast, claiming the sight amused me. When she began to weep, I demanded she thank me for the privilege of humiliation. She did so, which pleased me greatly. Power, I have discovered, is not merely having one's commands obeyed. It is watching someone's spirit break in real time. But it's his treatment of women that reveals the true depth of his pathology. Caroline of Brunswick, his official wife, bore the brunt of his hatred for over a decade. Their marriage was political, arranged to secure his debts and produce an heir, but George's resentment went far beyond mere incompatibility. He despised Caroline for being German, for being plain, for existing as a reminder of his own powerlessness in the face of royal duty. The wedding night, according to Caroline's later testimony to Parliament, lasted 3 hours and left her bloodied and traumatized. His Majesty, she would write years later, seemed to find pleasure not in the act itself, but in my evident suffering. When I begged him to be gentle, he became rougher. When I wept, he laughed. I realized then that I had not married a man, but something wearing a man's face. Their daughter, Princess Charlotte, would later confess to friends that she lived in terror of being alone with her father, not because of what he might do to her, but because of what she might witness him doing to others. Papa's rages, she wrote in a letter discovered after her death, are not human things. They are storms that destroy everything in their path and then move on as if nothing had happened. The king's impotence, both sexual and political, became the engine of his cruelty. As his body failed him, bloated and poisoned by decades of excess, his need to dominate grew more desperate. What he couldn't accomplish through physical prowess, he achieved through psychological terror. Servants learned to anticipate his moods by reading the smallest signs, the set of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed on armrests, the particular quality of silence that preceded an explosion. Lord Byron, who visited Carlton House several times during this period, wrote privately about witnessing one of the king's entertainments, a dinner where the monarch forced guests to watch as he systematically humiliated a young footman, making the boy perform increasingly demeaning tasks, while the assembled nobles ate in uncomfortable silence. "We were all complicit," Byron confessed in a letter to Lady Melbourne. "We watched a human soul being flayed alive, and we said nothing because the creature doing the flaying wore a crown. The king's rage toward women wasn't random, it was philosophical. In his laudanum-clouded mind, women represented everything he couldn't control: his mother's disappointment, his wife's independence, his mistress's eventual abandonment. Every woman became a battlefield where he could reclaim the power that leaked away through his addictions, his debts, his failures as a ruler and man. You finish polishing the silver and prepare to leave Carlton House as dawn breaks over London. In a few hours, the newspapers will report on the king's latest cultural patronage, his generous support of the arts, his refined taste in architecture and fashion. They will not mention Sarah, who still hasn't returned. They will not describe Mrs. Fitzherbert's careful makeup or the way she flinches when doors close too loudly. The king is unwell, but no one says it aloud. And those who try to speak find their words buried beneath the weight of gold, threats, and the terrible knowledge that monsters who wear crowns are the most dangerous monsters of all. You are Thomas Lawrence, the most celebrated portrait painter in England, and you are being asked to lie with oils and canvas. The man sitting before you bears little resemblance to the image the public adores. King George IV's face is bloated beyond recognition, his skin mottled with broken veins, his eyes glazed with the perpetual fog of laudanum. But the portrait you must create will show a dignified monarch, refined, regal, the very image of royal virtue. "Make me beautiful," the king slurs, his words thick with morning wine. "Make me what they need to see." This is how the machine works. Not through grand conspiracies or elaborate cover-ups, but through 1,000 small acts of creative deception. Each flattering portrait, each sanitized newspaper report, each carefully worded court announcement becomes another brick in the wall that separates George the King from George the Monster. Sir William Knighton has perfected this art over decades of royal service. As the King's private secretary and confidant, he controls every piece of information that leaves Carlton House. His network of influence extends through London's newspaper offices, publishing houses, and drawing rooms like a spider's web. When editors receive suggestions about which stories to emphasize and which to ignore, they understand the weight behind those gentle recommendations. His Majesty is indisposed due to a recurring stomach ailment. Knighton writes to the Times after the King's 3-day laudanum binge leaves him unconscious. The newspaper dutifully reports the monarch's dedication to duty despite his physical suffering. They do not mention the servants who found him collapsed in his own vomit, or the physician who had to administer stimulants to revive him. The machine has many moving parts. Lady Conyngham, the King's final great mistress, serves as more than just a sexual companion. She is his minister of public relations. Beautiful, intelligent, and utterly ruthless, she orchestrates the social gatherings that will be remembered and reported while ensuring the darker entertainments remain invisible. When foreign ambassadors visit, they see carefully choreographed performances. The king as cultured patron, surrounded by artists and intellectuals, discussing literature and music with apparent sophistication. They do not see the private dinners where the same king forces servants to bark like dogs for his amusement, or the games, where he bets on how long staff members can endure various humiliations before breaking down completely. The press manipulation operates on multiple levels. Positive stories aren't just encouraged, they're manufactured. The king's architectural projects receive breathless coverage, with journalists praising his exquisite taste and visionary design sense for buildings conceived entirely by hired architects. His fashion choices are analyzed like works of art, transforming a vain man's obsession with clothing into evidence of cultural sophistication. Meanwhile, negative stories disappear with surgical precision. When Lady Hertford's private letters surface, describing the king's violent behavior during their affair, the documents vanish before reaching any newspaper office. The courier who carried them is found dead in the Thames a week later, officially a suicide, though those who knew him whisper about threatening visitors who came calling in the days before his death. Dr. Halford, the king's primary physician, becomes an unwitting architect of deception through his medical reports. Every addiction is reframed as a medical necessity. Every violent outburst becomes a symptom of physical illness requiring rest and privacy. His Majesty's Constitution requires careful management. He writes to Parliament, when questioned about the king's frequent absences from public duties. The reality that the monarch is often too drunk or high to function remains buried beneath layers of professional euphemism. The machine's most brutal efficiency reveals itself in how it handles witnesses. Servants who see too much find themselves suddenly dismissed with generous severance packages and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Those who refuse to stay silent face more direct consequences. Mary Ann Clark, a former royal mistress who threatened to publish her memoirs, discovers that her publisher has withdrawn from the project. Her printer claims his equipment has mysteriously broken down. Her financial backers vanish overnight, their investments suddenly needed elsewhere. The few brave enough to persist find themselves facing criminal charges for unrelated offenses, their reputations destroyed by whisper campaigns that paint them as unreliable, vengeful, or mentally unstable. The message spreads through London's servant networks like wildfire. Speak against the king, and you will be crushed so thoroughly that you'll wish you had never been born. Portraiture becomes a weapon of mass deception. Every official image of the king undergoes careful editing, transforming a bloated drug addict into a noble patriarch. Lawrence's paintings show a man 20 years younger and 50 pounds lighter than reality. The king's famous coronation portrait presents him as a romantic figure, draped in ermine and velvet, his face radiant with divine authority. Viewers seeing this image would never imagine the same man forcing servants to lick wine from the floor, while guests applauded his wit. The royal collection grows through strategic acquisitions that burnish the king's reputation as a patron of arts. Masterpieces purchased with borrowed money are displayed as evidence of refined taste. The crushing debts that fund these purchases, debts that impoverish the nation, are hidden behind complex financial arrangements that make royal spending appear both modest and patriotic. Even the king's rare public appearances are carefully choreographed theatre. When he must be seen in public, he's surrounded by handlers who ensure optimal lighting, brief exposure, and audiences packed with supporters. His speeches are written by others, rehearsed until memorized, delivered from carefully positioned stages that hide his physical deterioration. The crowds see what they need to see. A king who looks the part, however briefly. The machine's greatest triumph comes in 1821, when Caroline of Brunswick returns to England to claim her place as queen. Her accusations against the king, abuse, abandonment, systematic cruelty, threaten to destroy the carefully constructed royal image. Within weeks, every newspaper in London runs stories about Caroline's own alleged misconduct, her foreign lovers, her inappropriate behavior. The woman who suffered years of royal brutality becomes the villain in her own story, while George emerges as the wounded husband, more sinned against than sinning. You finish the portrait, adding final touches that erase another decade from the king's face, another stone from his weight, another shadow from his character. The man who will be remembered by history bears no resemblance to the man who sits before you. But that is exactly as it should be. The machine has done its work. Tomorrow, this painting will hang in the Royal Academy, where viewers will marvel at their sovereign's noble bearing. They will never know that the real King George IV is upstairs in his private chambers, unconscious in a pool of his own excess, while servants clean up the wreckage of another night's entertainment. The king is unwell, but no one says it aloud. And thanks to the machine, no one ever will. You are Dr. Matthew Bailey, and your hands are shaking as you prepare the syringe. The king lies before you on silk sheets that cost more than most families earn in a year. His breathing shallow, his skin the color of old parchment. The morphine you're about to inject will keep him unconscious for the next 6 hours. You know this. He knows this. And still he demands it. More than yesterday, he whispers, his voice barely human. I need more. You are complicit in slow-motion suicide, and your medical oath has become a mockery. But your children need food, your wife needs medicine, and your own family's survival depends on this man's continued favor. So you inject the poison, watch his eyes roll back, and tell yourself it's treatment, not murder. You are not the only one trapped in this web of silence. In the servants' quarters beneath Carlton House, they whisper the names of the disappeared. Emma, the scullery maid who served the king's private dinner and was found floating in the Thames 3 days later. James, the footman who accidentally witnessed one of the king's entertainments and vanished so completely that even his family believes he ran away. Margaret, the lady's maid who tried to comfort Caroline of Brunswick during her darkest days and whose body was discovered in a ditch outside London. Officially the victim of highway robbery, though her purse remained untouched. These are not isolated tragedies. They are the systematic elimination of inconvenient truths carried out by men who call themselves loyal servants while serving as executioners for royal secrecy. You are Mrs. Charlotte Papendiek, former page of the backstairs to Queen Charlotte, and you've spent 15 years perfecting the art of seeing nothing. You've witnessed the king force servants to eat scraps from the floor like dogs. You've heard screams from locked rooms that lasted until dawn. You've seen young women enter the royal chambers bright-eyed and leave broken, their spirits shattered beyond repair. Your diary, hidden beneath floorboards in your modest home, contains truth that could topple governments, but you will never publish it, because you remember what happened to the Clarks, an entire family ruined because their daughter dared to refuse the king's advances. Their businesses mysteriously failed, their credit evaporated overnight. Their friends stopped visiting. Within 6 months, they were in debtor's prison, their children scattered to workhouses, their names synonymous with scandal, though no formal charges were ever filed. This is how the machine destroys its enemies, not through grand executions, but through quiet strangulation. Economic pressure applied gradually until resistance becomes impossible. Social isolation engineered so precisely that victims blame themselves for their fall from grace. The Honourable Frederick Ponsonby learns this lesson when he questions the king's treatment of Caroline of Brunswick. As an equerry in the royal household, he sees too much, knows too much, speaks too much. Within a week, his military commission is revoked for unspecified conduct unbecoming. His club membership is mysteriously terminated. His fiancée's family suddenly discovers urgent reasons to postpone the wedding indefinitely. Friends who once sought his company develop pressing engagements elsewhere. Ponsonby never speaks publicly against the crown again. But late at night, alone in his diminished lodgings, he writes letters to his sister that reveal the cost of conscience. I have learned that truth is a luxury only the powerless can afford. Those of us who serve power must choose between complicity and destruction. I chose to preserve myself, and in doing so, became something less than human. The emotional toll spreads like plague through everyone who orbits the king's darkness. Dr. Knighton, once an idealistic physician, now suffers from what he privately calls moral consumption, a wasting disease of the soul that leaves him hollow, mechanical, going through the motions of life while feeling nothing. His wife notices that he no longer laughs at their children's games, no longer shows interest in the beauty of spring flowers or the warmth of summer evenings. He has seen too much evil rationalized as necessity, participated in too much cruelty disguised as medicine. Lady Conyngham, the king's final mistress, pays perhaps the highest price of all. She maintains her position by becoming a perfect mirror of his depravity, reflecting back his cruelties with enthusiasm that disgusts even her. Her private letters, discovered decades later, reveal a woman who has forgotten her own moral center entirely. I encouraged him to greater excesses tonight, applauded when he made the servant boy weep, suggested refinements to his humiliations. I have become something I do not recognize, something that frightens me in quiet moments. But I cannot remember who I was before this, cannot imagine who I might be after. The children suffer most invisibly. Princess Charlotte grows up believing that power inevitably corrupts, that authority naturally leads to cruelty. Her brief marriage to Prince Leopold is haunted by nightmares where she becomes her father, where love transforms into domination without her willing it. She dies young, and those who knew her whisper that her heart simply couldn't bear the weight of what she'd inherited, not just a throne, but the knowledge of what thrones cost. The servants' children learn different lessons. They discover that survival requires the ability to become invisible, to anticipate violence before it arrives, to smile while being destroyed. These skills serve them well in adulthood, making them excellent servants to other terrible masters. The cycle perpetuates itself. Those who survive the king's household go on to enable other powerful men's cruelties, carrying their learned helplessness like a virus into new situations. You are Thomas Creevey, Member of Parliament and chronic gossip, and you've heard all the stories. The midnight screams, the mysterious deaths, the broken women and disappeared men. But you also know that speaking these truths would end not just your political career, but your access to the social world that gives your life meaning. So you write carefully coded diary entries that hint at scandals without naming them, preserving truth in amber while ensuring it never sees daylight. Your grandchildren will read these diaries and wonder what you were trying to say. They will sense the presence of something terrible lurking beneath your careful euphemisms, but they will never understand the full scope of what their grandfather witnessed and chose not to reveal. This is the true cost of George IV's reign, not just the immediate victims, but the institutional cowardice that his cruelties bred. Every person who looked away, stayed silent, or actively participated in the cover-up became a carrier of moral infection. They raised children who understood that powerful people are above accountability, that truth is negotiable when confronted with authority, that survival requires complicity with evil. The king is unwell, but no one says it aloud. And in that silence, a generation learns that monsters are not aberrations to be fought, but features of power to be accommodated. The king is dead, June 26th, 1830, and George IV's bloated corpse lies in state while London pretends to mourn. You are Sir Thomas Lawrence, the same portrait painter who spent decades making monsters look like angels, and now you watch the final act of the Great Deception unfold. Before the body is even cold, the machines of myth-making spring into action. The death announcement describes a beloved monarch who died peacefully after a life of service to his people. There is no mention of the cirrhosis that rotted his liver, the dropsy that swelled his body beyond human proportions, or the final delirium, where he screamed accusations at servants who had learned long ago to simply nod and wait for the madness to pass. Sir William Knighton works through the night, moving with the efficiency of a man who has planned for this moment for years. Crates of documents disappear from Carlton House. Personal letters, medical records, financial statements, testimonies from dismissed servants. Some are burned in the palace courtyards, their ashes scattered before dawn. Others vanish into private collections where they will gather dust for centuries, their explosive contents safely buried beneath layers of discretion and decay. The official biographers are already at work, their pens transforming a tyrant into a patron saint of British culture. The king's gambling debts become evidence of his generous spirit. His violent rages transform into passionate commitment to excellence. His cruelty towards servants becomes aristocratic, demanding of proper standards. Every vice is reframed as a virtue, every crime rewritten as a contribution to the nation's glory. Commemorative coins are struck, showing the king in his youthful prime. Elegant, refined, the embodiment of royal dignity. The medals contain not a trace of the obesity that defined his later years, no hint of the cruelty that defined his character. Future generations will handle these coins and imagine they know what George IV looked like, never suspecting they're touching carefully crafted lies made solid in precious metal. The portraits undergo systematic revision. Lawrence's earlier, more honest works are quietly removed from public display, replaced by idealized versions that show the king as he wished to be remembered rather than as he actually lived. The Royal Collection's curators become editors of history, choosing which images survive and which disappear, shaping public memory through strategic acts of preservation and destruction. Publishers receive guidance about which aspects of the late king's life deserve emphasis. His patronage of architecture, yes, celebrate that. His support for the arts, absolutely essential to mention. His private behavior, his treatment of family and servants, his decades of addiction and abuse. These topics are quietly discouraged, not forbidden but simply deemed not in the public interest, or inappropriate for general consumption. The machine that protected George IV in life continues its work in death, but now with even greater efficiency. The dead cannot contradict their own mythology. They cannot accidentally reveal truths that undermine carefully constructed narratives. Death transforms the king from a liability to be managed into a legend to be polished. Caroline of Brunswick's story vanishes from official histories. The woman who endured years of royal brutality becomes a footnote, mentioned only as an unfortunate marriage that ended in mutual incompatibility. Her detailed testimonies about the king's violence are lost, misfiled, or declared unreliable. Future historians will struggle to understand why the marriage failed, having been deprived of the evidence that would make everything clear. The servants who survived the king's reign face a final choice: accept generous pensions and maintain absolute silence, or find themselves suddenly unemployed and unemployable. Most choose survival over truth, taking their secrets to graves that bear no mention of what they witnessed. Their silence becomes complicity. Their survival becomes collaboration with the ongoing cover-up. But the machinery of deception reveals something more disturbing than individual corruption. It exposes the institutional rot that made George IV possible in the first place. The same systems that enabled his cruelties now work to erase evidence of those cruelties, proving that the problem was never one mad king but an entire structure designed to protect power at any cost. The British monarchy cannot afford to acknowledge what George IV really was, because admitting that truth would require examining the mechanisms that created and sustained him. How do you maintain the divine right of kings when one of your kings was demonstrably a monster? How do you justify absolute authority when that authority was used for systematic torture and abuse? The answer is simple. You bury the monster so deep that future generations cannot find the body. You create myths so beautiful that truth becomes ugly by comparison. You craft legends so compelling that reality seems small and petty and unworthy of serious consideration. This is royal rot at its most efficient, not the decay of individual character, but the systematic corruption of memory itself. The institution protects itself by making its failures invisible, its crimes unthinkable, its victims silent. George IV was not an aberration. He was the natural result of a system that places power above accountability, silence above truth, mythology above reality. The king is dead, but the machine that created him lives on. And in its continued operation, we see the real legacy of George IV's reign. The perfection of institutional amnesia, the art of making history forget what it cannot afford to remember. History is a mirror fogged by power. Sometimes the blood gets wiped off. Sometimes it's framed in gold. You thought you knew the story of British royalty, pageantry and tradition, centuries of noble service, a crown that represents the highest aspirations of civilization. But now you stand in the ruins of that illusion, surrounded by the scattered fragments of sanitized narratives and comfortable lies. What else have they told you was noble that was actually cruelty wrapped in velvet? Look at the portraits hanging in museums across the world. Those serene faces gazing down from gilded frames, how many hide the eyes of predators? How many of those elegant hands signed death warrants, ordered executions, authorized tortures that would make modern dictators seem restrained by comparison? The same brushstrokes that capture light on silk and lace also conceal stains that no amount of artistic skill can truly wash away. Consider the grand palaces that tourists photograph today, their marble corridors polished to perfection, their crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across ornate ceilings. These were not just homes, but crime scenes, their beauty purchased with blood, their grandeur built on foundations of systematic cruelty. Every room holds echoes of screams that were never recorded, tears that were never acknowledged, lives that were destroyed for the entertainment of people who believed their birth gave them the right to break others without consequence. You thought you were safe in the palace, but monsters don't hide in forests. They sit on thrones. The machinery that protected George IV continues its work today, adapted to modern media but fundamentally unchanged. Press releases that transform scandals into misunderstandings. Biographies that emphasize charitable work while glossing over documented abuses. Public relations campaigns that flood information channels with positive stories whenever negative ones threaten to surface. The techniques evolve, but the purpose remains constant: to ensure that power never truly faces accountability for its crimes, that the powerful are remembered for their contributions rather than their corruptions, that history serves the interests of institutions rather than the cause of truth. This is not unique to monarchy. Every system of concentrated power develops similar protective mechanisms. Corporate boardrooms, political parties, religious hierarchies, all learn to craft narratives that obscure their failures while amplifying their successes. All master the art of making their victims invisible while making their benefactors legendary. The fog on history's mirror isn't an accident. It's applied deliberately, methodically, by people who understand that controlling the past is the key to controlling the future. If you can make people forget what power actually looks like when it operates without restraint, you can convince them that current restraints are unnecessary, that oversight is disrespectful, that questioning authority is unpatriotic. But sometimes, if you look carefully enough, you can still see shapes moving behind the fog. Documents that survive despite systematic destruction. Testimonies that persist despite official denial. Evidence that refuses to stay buried, no matter how deep the graves or how heavy the headstones. George IV's story survived not because his victims were powerful enough to force accountability, but because some truths are too large to completely erase. The sheer scope of his cruelties, the systematic nature of the cover-up, the institutional complicity required to maintain the deception, all of this left traces that careful researchers could follow, breadcrumbs leading back to the gingerbread house, where children were devoured by creatures wearing crowns. You are living in a world shaped by similar deceptions, walking through landscapes where terrible truths have been carefully landscaped into invisible gardens. The statues you pass commemorate monsters who have been transformed into heroes. The institutions you respect maintain their dignity through selective amnesia. The traditions you honor carry forward the methods of tyrants while forgetting their faces. History is not what it seems. It is not a record of what happened, but a carefully curated collection of what the powerful want you to believe happened. The real story exists in the spaces between official narratives, in the testimonies that were buried, in the documents that were burned, in the screams that echo still through marble corridors where tourists now walk and take pictures. The blood has been wiped off the mirror, but the stains remain. Frame has been gilded, but the reflection shows monsters still. And sometimes, in the right light, at the right angle, you can see through the fog and witness the truth that power thought it had buried forever. You thought monsters were fairy tales. You were wrong. They were just well-dressed, well-documented, and very, very careful about who they allowed to tell their stories. The cost of mythologizing power is always paid by those who cannot afford it. The servants who cleaned up after royal tantrums, the women who bore the brunt of imperial rage, the children who learned that authority and cruelty were synonymous, the truth-tellers who discovered that some truths are too expensive for ordinary people to speak aloud. We wrap monsters in ermine and call them kings. We polish their legacies until they shine like crowns. We teach children to bow before portraits of people who would have destroyed those same children without a second thought if the mood had struck them and the circumstances allowed. But every so often, someone finds a diary hidden beneath floorboards, a letter preserved in forgotten archives, a testimony that survived despite systematic attempts at destruction. And slowly, carefully, we begin to unearth what was buried, not just bodies, but truth. Not just individual crimes, but institutional complicity. Not just royal rot, but the mechanisms that create and protect and perpetuate that rot across generations. History's mirror is fogged by power, but mirrors can be cleaned. Blood can be made visible again. The gold frames can be stripped away to reveal what they were designed to hide. George IV drank, he screamed, he ruled. And when he died, they buried the body, but not the truth.